When Victoria Sterling's divorce attorney looked her in the eye and said, "You have no realistic chance of winning this case," she smiled and quietly handed over a single folder that would cause opposing counsel to withdraw from the case within 48 hours. What happened next would transform not only Victoria's life, but also establish a new standard for matrimonial evidence preparation that lawyers still reference today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that changed everything began like countless others in the pristine kitchen of the Malibu estate that Victoria had called home for 12 years. Standing at the Marble Island, preparing breakfast for a husband who no longer bothered to acknowledge her presence, Victoria embodied the perfect image of a successful executive's wife. Her movements carried the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to maintain flawless domestic harmony while navigating increasingly turbulent marital waters. At 38, Victoria possessed the kind of understated elegance that comes from years of attending corporate galas and charity functions, where appearances mattered more than authentic connection. Her auburn hair was styled in the sophisticated bob that had become her signature, and her tailored clothing reflected the impeccable taste expected of someone married to David Sterling, the founding partner of Sterling and Associates, one of the most prestigious investment firms on the West Coast. What no one in their social circle understood, including David himself, was that Victoria's background in forensic accounting had never truly been abandoned despite her transition to the role of supportive spouse. The analytical skills that had made her exceptional at uncovering financial irregularities during her career at Morrison & Company continued to operate beneath the surface of her domestic responsibilities, creating an awareness of patterns and discrepancies that others consistently overlook. David Sterling descended the curved staircase that morning with the confident stride of a man who had never encountered a problem that money and influence could not resolve. At 45, he possessed the kind of practiced charm that had built his reputation as both a brilliant investment strategist and an irresistible presence at industry conferences. His silver-gray hair and expensive suits created an image of distinguished success that had opened doors throughout his career. "I have the Morrison Industries breakfast meeting at 8. David announced, accepting the perfectly prepared coffee that Victoria offered without acknowledgement or gratitude. "I will be staying at the downtown office tonight to prepare for the quarterly presentation." Victoria nodded with the same composed acceptance that had characterized her responses to David's increasingly frequent overnight absence. What he failed to recognize was that each casual announcement of his schedule provided additional data points that Victoria was systematically documenting in ways that would prove significant in contexts that David could not yet imagine. The Sterling marriage had not always operated with such emotional distance and casual disregard. During their early years together, David had appreciated Victoria's intellect and analytical capabilities, often seeking her insights on complex financial strategies and investment opportunities. Victoria had been a full partner in building the foundation of Sterling and Associates, contributing analytical frameworks and risk assessment protocols that had enabled the firm's rapid growth and exceptional performance. However, as David's success and industry prominence expanded, his appreciation for Victoria's contributions had gradually transformed into expectation and eventually into dismissive assumption that her role was purely supportive rather than substantive. The transition had been so gradual that Victoria herself had initially failed to recognize the systematic erosion of respect and partnership that was occurring within their relationship. The revelation that would ultimately catalyze Victoria's strategic response to her deteriorating marriage occurred during a casual conversation with Elena Rodriguez, her longtime friend who worked as a family law paralegal at Hartwell & Associates. Elena had been sharing observations about common patterns in high-asset divorce cases when she made a comment that crystallized Victoria's understanding of her own vulnerable position. "The wives who get destroyed in these proceedings are always the ones who trusted their husbands to handle everything," Elena had explained during their monthly lunch meeting. "They never maintained independent documentation of assets, never understood the true scope of their financial situation, and never anticipated that the same person who promised to protect them would eventually use their ignorance against them." Victoria's response to Elena's insights reflected the analytical mindset that had made her exceptional at forensic accounting. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by the potential complexity of documenting her marital financial situation, Victoria approached the challenge with the systematic methodology that had characterized her professional work. She understood that comprehensive documentation would require patience, discretion, and access to information that David assumed she neither possessed nor understood. The development of Victoria's evidence compilation system began with careful observation of David's daily routines and communication patterns. She identified the periods when David was predictably absent from the house, the locations where he maintained important documents, and the digital systems that contained information about their financial assets and business operations. Victoria's approach was methodical rather than impulsive, strategic rather than emotional. Victoria's background in forensic accounting provided her with sophisticated understanding of how financial information could be concealed, manipulated, or misrepresented during legal proceedings. She recognized that effective documentation would require not just copying existing records but also understanding the relationships between different types of financial data and anticipating the strategies that opposing counsel might employ to minimize her claims during divorce proceedings. The physical setup that Victoria established for her documentation project reflected both her analytical training and her understanding of the need for absolute discretion. She converted a small storage room adjacent to their home office into a comprehensive research facility, complete with scanning equipment, secure file storage, and computer systems that were independent of the household networks that David might monitor. Victoria's documentation methodology incorporated lessons learned from her forensic accounting experience about the importance of establishing clear chains of custody for evidence and maintaining detailed records of when and how information was obtained. Each document was scanned, cataloged, and cross-referenced with related materials to create a comprehensive database that could withstand the scrutiny of aggressive opposing counsel. The scope of Victoria's investigation expanded as she gained access to information that revealed the true complexity of their financial situation. David had consistently presented their assets and income in simplified terms that Victoria now recognized had been designed to limit her understanding rather than promote genuine transparency. The reality included multiple business entities, offshore investment accounts, real estate holdings registered under various corporate names, and financial instruments that generated income streams David had never acknowledged. Victoria's discovery process revealed systematic patterns of financial behavior that suggested David had been preparing for potential divorce proceedings long before any formal discussions of marital problems had occurred. Transfers of assets to accounts that Victoria could not access, establishment of business relationships that excluded her involvement, and creation of financial obligations that would reduce the apparent value of marital assets during any future division proceeding. The emotional impact of discovering David's systematic preparation for divorce while maintaining the pretense of marital commitment created a profound shift in Victoria's understanding of their relationship. She recognized that David's casual dismissiveness and increasing emotional distance were not symptoms of temporary stress, but rather indicators of a deliberate strategy to minimize her claims on assets that she had helped to accumulate. Victoria's response to these revelations reflected the same analytical discipline that had made her exceptional at forensic accounting. Rather than confronting David with accusations or demands for explanation, Victoria intensified her documentation efforts, while maintaining the appearance of domestic normalcy that would preserve her access to information. She understood that premature revelation of her knowledge would enable David to implement additional asset protection strategies that could significantly reduce her eventual settlement. The development of Victoria's comprehensive evidence file required approximately 8 months of systematic investigation and documentation. During this period, Victoria maintained her role as the supportive spouse while simultaneously conducting the most thorough financial analysis of her career. The irony was not lost on Victoria that her husband's success had been built partially on her analytical capabilities, which were now being employed to ensure that she received fair treatment during the dissolution of their marriage. Victoria's preparation extended beyond financial documentation to include careful research of family law procedures, precedent cases involving similar asset structures, and strategic considerations that would influence the selection of appropriate legal representation. She understood that the quality of her legal counsel would be crucial to effectively utilizing the evidence she was compiling, and that many attorneys might be intimidated by the complexity of her case or influenced by David's industry connection. The selection of Margaret Chen as Victoria's divorce attorney reflected careful analysis of lawyers who possessed both the technical expertise necessary to understand complex financial structures and the independence required to pursue aggressive strategies against well-connected opposing parties. Margaret's reputation for thorough preparation and willingness to challenge powerful opponents made her the ideal advocate for Victoria's situation. Victoria's initial consultation with Margaret Chen provided the first opportunity to present the comprehensive evidence file that had been developed through months of systematic investigation. Margaret's response to Victoria's documentation reflected both professional admiration for the quality of analysis and strategic excitement about the strength of the case that Victoria had assembled. "This level of financial documentation is unprecedented in my experience," Margaret observed while reviewing Victoria's organized presentation of asset valuations, income projections, and evidence of systematic asset concealment. "Most clients arrive with incomplete understanding of their financial situation and limited evidence to support their claims. You have compiled a comprehensive case file that addresses every aspect of marital asset identification and valuation." The thoroughness of Victoria's preparation created strategic advantages that would prove crucial during the aggressive legal proceedings that David's counsel would initiate. Victoria had anticipated the arguments that opposing counsel would present and had assembled evidence that would counter each potential strategy for minimizing her settlement. Her documentation included not just current asset valuations, but also historical data that demonstrated the appreciation patterns and income generation that she had contributed to through her analytical insights during the early years of their marriage. Victoria's evidence file also included documentation of David's extramarital relationships and associated financial expenditures that could influence both the grounds for divorce and the calculation of appropriate settlement amount. Victoria's systematic approach had identified patterns of behavior in financial transactions that clearly demonstrated David's breach of marital obligations and his use of marital assets to support relationships that violated their marriage agreement. The completion of Victoria's evidence compilation marked the end of the foundation-building phase of her divorce strategy and the beginning of legal proceedings that would demonstrate the power of comprehensive preparation combined with exceptional analytical capability. Victoria had transformed herself from a vulnerable spouse dependent on her husband's financial disclosures into a formidable legal adversary armed with evidence that would ultimately prove overwhelming to opposing counsel. As Victoria prepared for the initial legal confrontations that would determine the trajectory of her divorce proceedings, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from trusted wife to strategic legal opponent. The analytical skills that David had once valued in their partnership were now being employed to ensure that she received fair treatment during the dissolution of that same partnership. The overlooked foundation of competence and preparation was about to emerge as the decisive factor in proceedings that opposing counsel had assumed would be easily resolved in David's favor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transformation from supportive spouse to formidable legal adversary had been accomplished through patience, systematic analysis, and comprehensive preparation, rather than dramatic confrontation or emotional outburst. Victoria had learned that the most powerful response to dismissive treatment was not protest, but rather the quiet accumulation of evidence that would speak more persuasively than any argument. The foundation had been established for proceedings that would demonstrate the true value of thorough preparation and analytical excellence in contexts where others had assumed that influence and resources would determine the outcome. Standing in the marble kitchen where this journey had begun, Victoria understood that the breakfast routine would soon be replaced by legal proceedings that would test every aspect of the preparation and analysis she had conducted over the previous month. The overlooked observer was about to become the dominant force in negotiations that would establish not only her financial independence, but also a new standard for matrimonial evidence preparation that would influence how similar cases were approached for years to come. Victoria Sterling's systematic approach to evidence gathering revealed patterns of financial behavior that extended far beyond what she had initially suspected. The deeper she delved into David's business operations and personal transactions, the more sophisticated his asset concealment strategies appeared to be. What had begun as documentation of marital assets evolved into a comprehensive investigation that exposed systematic financial manipulation spanning multiple years and involving numerous business entities. The breakthrough discovery occurred during Victoria's analysis of David's corporate credit card statements, which she had been meticulously cataloging for 6 months. Her forensic accounting training had taught her to look for patterns that appeared normal on the surface, but represented systematic anomalies when analyzed over extended periods. The pattern that emerged from David's expense reports suggested a level of financial deception that went far beyond casual marital dishonesty. Victoria identified recurring monthly payments to consulting firms that had no apparent business purpose, regular transfers to investment accounts that were not reflected in their personal financial statements, and travel expenses that did not correlate with the business meetings David had described to her. Each individual transaction appeared legitimate when viewed in isolation, but the collective patterns suggested systematic diversion of marital assets to accounts and entities that Victoria could not access. The sophisticated nature of David's financial arrangements became apparent when Victoria attempted to trace the ultimate destinations of these diverted funds. Her investigation revealed a complex network of limited liability companies, offshore investment vehicles, and trust arrangements that had been structured to minimize transparency and maximize David's control over assets that should have been considered marital property under California law. Victoria's forensic accounting experience provided her with the analytical frameworks necessary to understand how these structures functioned and to identify the specific strategies David was employing to reduce the apparent value of their marital estate. She recognized that opposing counsel would likely argue that many of these assets were business investments or legitimate tax optimization strategies, rather than marital property subject to division during divorce proceedings. The documentation of David's asset concealment strategies required Victoria to develop investigative capabilities that extended beyond her original forensic accounting training. She learned to use public record databases, corporate filing systems, and international business directories to trace the ownership structures and operational relationships that connected David's various business entities. The research process was both intellectually challenging and emotionally devastating, as Victoria discovered the extent to which David had been systematically preparing for their eventual divorce. Victoria's investigation revealed that David's asset protection planning had begun approximately 3 years earlier, coinciding with the period when their marital relationship had begun deteriorating, but before any formal discussions of divorce had occurred. This timeline suggested that David had been anticipating the end of their marriage while continuing to present the appearance of commitment and partnership. The discovery created a profound sense of betrayal that Victoria channeled into even more thorough documentation and analysis. The emotional impact of discovering David's systematic deception was compounded by Victoria's recognition that her own analytical contributions to Sterling and Associates had likely enabled some of the financial strategies that were now being used against her. The risk assessment protocols and investment frameworks that Victoria had developed during the early years of their marriage had been refined and expanded to create sophisticated asset protection structures that excluded her from any meaningful participation or oversight. Victoria's response to these revelations reflected the same analytical discipline that had made her exceptional at forensic accounting. Rather than allowing emotional reactions to compromise her investigation, Victoria used her growing understanding of David's strategies to refine her documentation approach and anticipate the legal arguments that opposing counsel would likely present. She understood that her evidence would need to be not only comprehensive, but also presented in ways that would be compelling to judges and mediators who might initially be sympathetic to arguments about legitimate business planning. The expansion of Victoria's investigation beyond financial records required her to develop additional capabilities in areas such as digital forensics and communication analysis. She learned to recover deleted emails, analyze communication patterns, and identify relationships that David had attempted to conceal. This broader investigation revealed personal relationships and business arrangements that provided crucial context for understanding the financial structures that David had created. Victoria's analysis of David's communication patterns revealed systematic coordination with financial advisors, attorneys, and business associates who had been assisting with asset protection planning while David maintained the pretense of marital normalcy. The email communications and document exchanges that Victoria recovered provided clear evidence that David's financial planning had been specifically designed to minimize her claims during anticipated divorce proceedings. The discovery of David's coordination with professional advisors who specialized in asset protection during divorce proceedings provided Victoria with valuable intelligence about the strategies that opposing counsel would likely employ. She was able to identify the specific arguments and precedent cases that David's legal team would reference, enabling her to prepare counter-arguments and supporting evidence that would neutralize these anticipated strategies. Victoria's growing expertise in matrimonial asset investigation led her to recognize patterns of behavior that extended beyond her own marriage. Her research revealed that David's approach to asset concealment reflected established strategies that were commonly employed by high-net-worth individuals who anticipated contentious divorce proceedings. This recognition enabled Victoria to access additional resources and precedent cases that would strengthen her legal position. The sophistication of Victoria's analytical approach attracted the attention of other professionals who specialized in complex matrimonial asset investigation. Through her research, Victoria connected with forensic accountants, private investigators, and legal specialists who provided additional expertise and validation for her findings. These professional relationships would prove crucial during the litigation phase of her divorce proceedings. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic accounting specialist who had testified in numerous high-profile divorce cases, reviewed Victoria's documentation and provided expert analysis that confirmed the significance of her discoveries. Dr. Foster's assessment validated Victoria's conclusion that David's asset concealment strategies represented systematic financial fraud that violated both his fiduciary obligations as a spouse and his disclosure requirements under California family law. The level of sophistication and systematic implementation evident in these asset protection structures suggest professional coordination and long-term planning. Dr. Foster explained during her analysis of Victoria's evidence. This is not casual financial planning but rather deliberate concealment designed to minimize marital asset division during anticipated divorce proceedings. Dr. Foster's expert analysis provided Victoria with additional credibility and analytical frameworks that would prove valuable during legal proceedings. More importantly, Dr. Foster's validation of Victoria's investigative approach confirmed that the evidence Victoria had compiled was sufficiently comprehensive and professionally documented to withstand aggressive challenges from opposing counsel. Victoria's investigation also revealed that David's asset concealment strategies included systematic undervaluation of business interest and manipulation of income recognition timing to minimize the apparent value of marital assets during the specific period when divorce proceedings would occur. These sophisticated strategies required coordination with accountants and financial advisors who understood the specific requirements of California family law and the methodologies that courts typically employed for asset valuation during divorce proceedings. The discovery of systematic income manipulation provided Victoria with additional evidence that David had been preparing for divorce proceedings while maintaining the pretense of marital commitment. The timing of certain business decisions and financial transactions clearly demonstrated that David's planning had been designed to minimize his apparent income and asset values during the period when court-ordered financial disclosures would be required. Victoria's analysis of David's business operations revealed additional strategies for asset concealment that involved transferring ownership interest to family members and business associates who would hold these assets temporarily during divorce proceedings and then transfer them back to David after the settlement was finalized. These arrangements represented fraudulent transfers that violated both family law requirements and general commercial law principles regarding creditor rights. The documentation of fraudulent transfer arrangements required Victoria to expand her investigation to include analysis of relationships and transactions involving David's extended family and business associates. This broader investigation revealed a network of individuals
who had been recruited to participate in asset concealment strategy, providing Victoria with additional evidence of systematic planning and coordination that would be compelling to courts evaluating the authenticity of David's financial disclosure. Victoria's comprehensive investigation ultimately revealed that David's apparent net worth, as he would likely represent it during divorce proceedings, significantly understated the true value of assets that should be considered marital property subject to division. Victoria's analysis indicated that the actual value of divisible assets exceeded David's likely disclosures by more than $15 million, representing a discrepancy that would fundamentally alter the financial dynamics of their divorce settlement. The magnitude of Victoria's discoveries created both opportunities and challenges for her legal strategy. While the evidence of systematic asset concealment provided powerful arguments for favorable settlement terms, the complexity of David's financial structures would require sophisticated legal presentation and expert testimony to ensure that courts understood the significance of Victoria's findings. Victoria's preparation for the litigation phase of her divorce required coordination with legal specialists who possessed experience in complex asset tracing and matrimonial fraud cases. Margaret Chen's law firm assembled a team of experts that included forensic accountants, business valuation specialists, and international asset recovery consultants who could provide the technical expertise necessary to present Victoria's evidence effectively during legal proceedings. The collaborative preparation process revealed that Victoria's individual investigative work had achieved a level of comprehensiveness and analytical sophistication that impressed seasoned professionals who specialized in complex matrimonial asset cases. Victoria's systematic approach and attention to detail had produced evidence that exceeded the quality typically available in even the most well-resourced divorce proceeding. Victoria's transformation from dependent spouse to expert matrimonial asset investigator reflected both her analytical capabilities and her determination to ensure fair treatment during divorce proceedings. The patterns she had identified through months of systematic investigation provided the foundation for legal arguments that would ultimately prove overwhelming to opposing counsel who had initially assumed that David's financial sophistication and professional connections would enable him to minimize his settlement obligation. The pattern recognition phase of Victoria's preparation demonstrated that comprehensive analysis and systematic investigation could overcome significant advantages in resources and professional connection. Victoria's success in exposing David's asset concealment strategies validated the principle that thorough preparation and analytical excellence could triumph over attempts to manipulate legal proceedings through financial sophistication and procedural complexity. As Victoria prepared to transition from investigation to litigation, she understood that the patterns she had identified would need to be presented in ways that clearly demonstrated both the scope of David's deception and the legal implications of his systematic asset concealment. The evidence compilation phase had been completed, and the next stage would require transforming analytical insights into compelling legal arguments that would ensure Victoria received fair treatment during the resolution of their divorce proceeding. Victoria Sterling's comprehensive evidence compilation had reached a level of sophistication that required specialized legal expertise to ensure effective presentation during divorce proceedings. The complexity of David's asset concealment strategies demanded a collaborative approach that combined Victoria's analytical discoveries with the technical knowledge of professionals who understood both the legal implications of matrimonial fraud and the procedural requirements for presenting complex financial evidence in family court. Margaret Chen's initial assessment of Victoria's evidence file led to the formation of a professional alliance that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of the Sterling divorce proceeding.
Margaret recognized that Victoria's systematic investigation had produced evidence that exceeded the scope of typical matrimonial asset disputes and required coordination with specialists who possessed experience in complex financial fraud cases and international asset recovery. The first addition to Victoria's legal team was Dr. Richard Morrison, a forensic accounting expert whose practice focused exclusively on matrimonial asset investigations involving sophisticated concealment strategies. Morrison's analysis of Victoria's documentation confirmed that David's financial arrangements represented systematic planning that violated multiple aspects of California family law and potentially constituted criminal fraud in addition to civil violations. Dr. Morrison's professional assessment provided Victoria with crucial validation that her investigative approach had achieved the level of comprehensiveness necessary to support aggressive legal strategies during divorce proceedings. His experience with similar cases enabled him to identify additional investigative opportunities and to recommend specific types of evidence that would strengthen Victoria's position during anticipated challenges from opposing counsel. The systematic nature of these financial arrangements suggests coordination with professional advisors who understood the specific requirements of California family law, Dr. Morrison explained during his initial consultation with Victoria's legal team. The timing and structure of these transactions indicate deliberate planning designed to minimize disclosure obligations and reduce apparent asset values during anticipated divorce proceedings. Morrison's analysis extended beyond validation of Victoria's findings to include strategic recommendations for presenting evidence in ways that would be compelling to family court judges who might lack technical expertise in complex financial structures. His experience had taught him that even comprehensive evidence could fail to achieve appropriate outcomes if not presented with sufficient clarity and legal context. The second crucial addition to Victoria's professional alliance was Elena Vasquez, a private investigator whose specialized practice involved international asset tracing and recovery in high-net-worth divorce cases. Elena's capabilities complemented Victoria's analytical work by providing access to investigative resources and international databases that could trace asset transfers and ownership structures across multiple jurisdictions. Elena's investigation revealed that David's asset concealment strategy extended beyond domestic financial arrangements to include offshore entities and international investment vehicles that had been structured to minimize both tax obligations and disclosure requirements during potential legal proceedings. These international components added significant complexity to Victoria's case, but also provided additional evidence of systematic planning and sophisticated legal coordination. The offshore structures identified in your documentation represent standard asset protection strategies employed by individuals who anticipate contentious divorce proceedings. Elena reported during her analysis of Victoria's evidence file. The timing and coordination of these arrangements with domestic asset transfers suggests professional planning that began well before any formal marriage difficulties became apparent. Elena's international investigation capabilities enabled Victoria's team to trace the ultimate destinations of funds that had been transferred through complex networks of business entities and investment vehicles. This analysis revealed that assets representing several $1 million in value had been moved to jurisdictions that would complicate recovery efforts during traditional divorce proceedings, but which could be traced and potentially recovered through specialized legal strategy. The third member of Victoria's professional alliance was Thomas Chen, a business valuation expert whose practice focused on determining accurate valuations for closely held companies and professional practices during matrimonial asset division. Thomas's analysis of Sterling and Associates revealed that David had been systematically undervaluing the firm through accounting methods and business structure modifications that reduced its apparent worth for divorce settlement purposes. Thomas's valuation analysis demonstrated that Sterling and Associates possessed significantly greater value than David's internal financial statements indicated, due to both conservative accounting practices and deliberate understatement of revenue potential and asset value. The discrepancy between Thomas's professional valuation and David's likely representations created additional evidence of systematic financial manipulation designed to minimize settlement obligations. The business valuation methodologies employed in the firm's internal financial statements are inconsistent with standard practices for matrimonial asset division. Thomas explained during his presentation to Victoria's legal team that the conservative approaches being used significantly understate the firm's actual value and revenue potential, which suggests deliberate planning to minimize apparent asset values during anticipated divorce proceedings. Thomas's analysis also revealed that Victoria's analytical contributions during the early years of Sterling and Associates had been more significant than David acknowledged, and that her intellectual property contributions to the firm's risk assessment frameworks and investment methodologies represented valuable assets that should be considered during property division discussion. The formation of Victoria's professional alliance created strategic advantages that extended beyond the technical expertise provided by individual specialists. The collaborative approach enabled comprehensive preparation that addressed every aspect of David's asset concealment strategies, while anticipating the arguments and procedural challenges that opposing counsel would likely present during litigation. Margaret Chen coordinated the efforts of Victoria's specialist team to ensure that their combined expertise would be presented effectively during legal proceedings. Her experience with complex matrimonial cases had taught her that even the most compelling evidence could fail to achieve appropriate outcomes without careful coordination and strategic presentation that accounted for both legal requirements and practical courtroom dynamics. The collaborative preparation process revealed additional patterns and evidence that had not been apparent from Victoria's individual investigation. The combination of Dr. Morrison's forensic accounting analysis, Elena's international asset tracing, and Thomas's business valuation expertise created a comprehensive understanding of David's financial strategies that exceeded what any individual investigator could have achieved. Victoria's role within this professional alliance evolved from evidence compiler to strategic coordinator, who possessed unique insights into David's business operations and personal behavior patterns. Her intimate knowledge of Sterling and Associates and her understanding of David's decision-making processes provided crucial context that enabled the specialist team to focus their efforts on the most significant opportunities for asset recovery and evidence development. The professional relationships that Victoria developed during this collaborative preparation process provided her with valuable insights into the broader dynamics of high-net-worth divorce proceedings. She learned that her systematic approach to evidence compilation was exceptional, even among clients who possessed significant resources and professional connections, and that her analytical capabilities had produced documentation that exceeded the quality typically available in complex matrimonial cases. Morrison's feedback regarding Victoria's investigative work provided professional validation that reinforced her confidence in pursuing aggressive legal strategies during divorce proceedings. His assessment confirmed that Victoria's evidence compilation had achieved a level of comprehensiveness that would enable her legal team to pursue maximum settlement terms while maintaining credibility with family court judges who would evaluate her claim. The quality and systematic organization of your evidence documentation represents the most comprehensive matrimonial asset investigation I have encountered in 20 years of practice. Dr. Morrison informed Victoria during their strategic planning session. The analytical frameworks you have applied and the attention to detail, evident in your documentation, provide us with exceptional advantages during anticipated litigation. Elena's international investigation capabilities revealed additional evidence that strengthened Victoria's position while providing strategic options for asset recovery that would not be available through traditional divorce proceedings. Her analysis demonstrated that David's offshore arrangements could be challenged through legal strategies that combined family law proceedings with international asset recovery techniques. The comprehensive nature of Victoria's evidence file enabled her professional alliance to develop multiple strategic approaches that could be adapted based on the specific tactics employed by opposing counsel. This flexibility provided crucial advantages during negotiations and litigation, as Victoria's team could respond effectively to various defensive strategies while maintaining consistent pressure for full disclosure and fair asset division. Thomas's business valuation analysis provided Victoria with powerful leverage during settlement negotiations by establishing clear evidence that David's representations of Sterling and Associates' value would significantly understate the firm's actual worth. This valuation discrepancy created compelling arguments for enhanced settlement terms,
while demonstrating the systematic nature of David's asset concealment strategy. The professional alliance also provided Victoria with access to precedent cases and legal strategies that had proven effective in similar situations involving sophisticated asset concealment and matrimonial fraud. This research revealed that courts had consistently imposed significant penalties on parties who attempted to manipulate divorce proceedings through systematic financial deception, providing additional confidence that Victoria's aggressive legal strategy would achieve appropriate outcomes. Margaret Chen's coordination of the specialist team's efforts ensured that Victoria's evidence would be presented in ways that maximized its impact while addressing the procedural requirements of family court proceedings. Her experience had taught her that comprehensive evidence required equally sophisticated presentation strategies to ensure that judges understood both the technical details and the broader legal implications of systematic asset concealment. The collaborative approach employed by Victoria's professional alliance created synergistic effects that enhanced the value of each specialist's individual contribution. Morrison's forensic accounting analysis gained additional credibility when supported by Elena's international asset tracing and Thomas's business valuation expertise, creating a comprehensive case that would be difficult for opposing counsel to challenge effectively. Victoria's transformation from isolated investigation to collaborative legal strategy demonstrated the power of combining individual analytical excellence with professional expertise and strategic coordination. Her systematic approach to evidence compilation had created the foundation for a professional alliance that possessed capabilities far exceeding what traditional divorce proceedings typically involve. The development of Victoria's professional alliance marked a crucial transition from evidence compilation to strategic preparation for legal proceedings that would determine both the immediate outcome of her divorce and potentially establish new precedents for addressing sophisticated asset concealment in matrimonial cases. The underground network of expertise had evolved into a formalized collaboration between recognized professionals who possessed the capabilities necessary to ensure that Victoria's comprehensive evidence would achieve maximum impact during upcoming legal confrontation. Victoria understood that the formation of her professional alliance represented more than tactical preparation for divorce proceedings. The collaborative relationship she had developed provided validation of her analytical capabilities while creating a platform for pursuing outcomes that would establish new standards for addressing financial fraud in matrimonial cases. The overlooked spouse had become the center of a professional collaboration that would ultimately transform not only her personal situation, but also the broader legal landscape for addressing sophisticated asset concealment during divorce proceedings. The formal initiation of divorce proceedings between Victoria and David Sterling began with what appeared to be a routine case management conference in the downtown family court building. David arrived accompanied by his attorney, Catherine Walsh, whose reputation as one of the most aggressive matrimonial lawyers in the state had been carefully cultivated through decades of representing high-net-worth clients in contentious divorce cases. Catherine's presence signaled David's intention to pursue an aggressive strategy designed to minimize his settlement obligations while maximizing the procedural obstacles that Victoria would face during litigation. Catherine Walsh possessed the kind of institutional credibility and professional connections that typically enabled her clients to achieve favorable outcomes, even in cases where the factual circumstances might not fully support their position. Her approach to matrimonial litigation combined sophisticated legal arguments with strategic procedural maneuvering that could overwhelm less experienced opposing counsel and intimidate clients who lacked comprehensive preparation for the complexities of high-asset divorce proceedings. Victoria's initial encounter with Catherine Walsh occurred during the preliminary discovery phase, when opposing counsel attempted to establish the parameters for asset disclosure and financial documentation. Catherine's opening strategy reflected the assumption that Victoria possessed limited understanding of their financial situation and could be pressured into accepting inadequate settlement terms through aggressive legal tactics and assertions about the strength of David's legal position. Mrs. Sterling appears to have unrealistic expectations regarding the scope of marital assets subject to division. Catherine announced during the first substantive conference between legal teams. Our preliminary analysis indicates that the assets she believes exist are either separate property acquired before marriage or business investments that do not qualify as marital property under California law. Catherine's dismissive characterization of Victoria's claims reflected standard tactics employed by aggressive matrimonial attorneys who sought to establish psychological advantages through early demonstrations of superior legal knowledge and procedural sophistication. Her approach was designed to create doubt about Victoria's understanding of family law requirements, while positioning David as the more credible party regarding financial disclosure and asset valuation. Margaret Chen's response to Catherine's opening strategy reflected careful preparation and strategic patience rather than immediate confrontation. Margaret understood that premature revelation of Victoria's comprehensive evidence would enable opposing counsel to develop counter-strategies and potentially implement additional asset protection measures before formal discovery procedures could compel complete disclosure. "We appreciate opposing counsel's preliminary assessment," Margaret replied diplomatically. "However, our investigation suggests that a more comprehensive analysis of the relevant financial data may reveal additional assets and income streams that warrant consideration during settlement discussion." The measured tone of Margaret's response concealed the strategic advantages that Victoria's evidence compilation had created while avoiding premature revelation that might compromise her team's ability to present their findings effectively during formal proceedings. Margaret's experience had taught her that the most powerful evidence often achieved maximum impact when presented systematically rather than disclosed piecemeal during preliminary negotiation. Catherine Walsh's confidence in her initial assessment of Victoria's case reflected assumptions about typical matrimonial disputes involving sophisticated financial structure. Her experience had taught her that most opposing parties lacked the analytical capabilities necessary to understand complex business arrangements and could be overwhelmed by aggressive assertions about asset classification and valuation methodologies. The first indication that Victoria's case differed significantly from Catherine's expectations emerged during the formal discovery process when Margaret Chen submitted document requests that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Sterling and Associates' business operations and David's personal financial arrangements. The specificity and technical precision of these requests suggested access to information that opposing counsel had assumed would not be available to Victoria. Catherine's review of Margaret's discovery requests revealed demands for documentation regarding offshore investment vehicle limited liability company ownership structures and international business relationships that David had not anticipated would be identified during routine matrimonial proceedings. The comprehensive nature of these requests indicated that Victoria's legal team possessed detailed knowledge of financial arrangements that David had assumed would remain concealed during divorce proceedings. The discovery requests submitted by opposing counsel appear to be based on speculation rather than actual knowledge of relevant financial information, Catherine responded during the discovery dispute conference. Many of these demands seek documentation for business arrangements that either do not exist or are not relevant to matrimonial asset division under applicable family law principles. Catherine's defensive response reflected growing concern about the scope of Victoria's apparent knowledge, while maintaining the strategic position that David's financial disclosures would be adequate to resolve asset division issues. Her assertion that Victoria's discovery requests were speculative was designed to avoid providing documentation that might confirm the existence of assets that David preferred to exclude from matrimonial proceedings. Margaret Chen's reply to Catherine's defensive strategy marked the beginning of systematic revelation that would ultimately overwhelm opposing counsel's ability to maintain David's preferred narrative regarding their financial situation. Margaret's approach involved gradual disclosure of specific evidence that demonstrated not only the existence of concealed assets, but also the systematic nature of David's asset protection planning. Our discovery requests are based on specific documentation and factual analysis, rather than speculation, Margaret informed the court during the discovery dispute hearing. We are prepared to provide the court with detailed evidence supporting each of our document demands, including financial records and business communications that demonstrate the existence and relevance of the requested information. The judge's decision to require opposing counsel to respond to Victoria's discovery requests marked the first procedural victory that reflected the strength of her evidence compilation. The court's ruling indicated judicial recognition that Victoria's legal team possessed sufficient factual foundation to justify their comprehensive document demands, creating legal obligations for David to provide information he had hoped to conceal. Catherine Walsh's response to the court's discovery order revealed the first signs of uncertainty about her initial assessment of Victoria's case. The requirement to produce documentation regarding offshore arrangements and complex business structures would potentially expose asset concealment strategies that opposing counsel had assumed would remain hidden during typical matrimonial proceedings. David's reaction to the comprehensive discovery requirements reflected growing awareness that Victoria's legal strategy differed significantly from what he had anticipated. His consultations with Catherine Walsh during this period focused on developing strategies for minimizing the impact of required disclosures while maintaining the narrative that their financial situation was less complex than Victoria's discovery requests suggested. The production of documents in response to Victoria's discovery requests provided Margaret Chen with the opportunity to demonstrate the accuracy and comprehensiveness of her client's preliminary investigation. Each document that David produced confirmed details that Victoria had already identified through her independent analysis, validating her investigative approach while establishing the credibility necessary for presenting additional evidence that opposing counsel had not yet anticipated. Victoria's systematic comparison of David's formal discovery responses with her independent documentation revealed significant omissions and misrepresentations that provided additional evidence of systematic asset concealment. The discrepancies between David's sworn financial declarations and the evidence that Victoria had compiled created powerful arguments for sanctions and enhanced settlement terms based on discovery violations and matrimonial fraud. Dr. Morrison's analysis of David's discovery responses confirmed that the financial statements and asset disclosures provided by opposing counsel significantly understated both the value of identifiable assets and the existence of additional financial arrangements that should be considered marital property. His professional assessment provided expert validation for Victoria's claims while establishing the analytical framework necessary for presenting complex financial evidence during formal proceedings. Catherine Walsh's growing concern about the strength of Victoria's evidence became apparent during settlement discussions when she began exploring the possibility of resolving the case through negotiation rather than proceeding to trial. Her shift from aggressive litigation strategy to settlement exploration reflected recognition that continued proceedings might expose additional evidence that would further compromise David's position. Our client remains open to reasonable settlement discussions that reflect the actual scope of marital assets, Catherine informed Margaret Chen during preliminary negotiations. However, any settlement agreement must be based on realistic asset valuations rather than speculative claims about financial arrangements that may not constitute marital property. Margaret's response to Catherine's settlement overtures reflected strategic patience and confidence in the strength of Victoria's evidence. Rather than accepting immediate settlement offers that might provide inadequate compensation, Margaret indicated willingness to continue with formal proceedings that would fully establish the value of marital assets and the extent of David's asset concealment activity. The turning point in opposing counsel's assessment of Victoria's case occurred when Margaret Chen provided Catherine Walsh with a comprehensive preview of the evidence that would be presented during formal proceedings. This strategic revelation was designed to demonstrate the futility of continued resistance while providing opposing counsel with the opportunity to advise David regarding the legal consequences of his asset concealment strategy. Margaret's evidence presentation included detailed documentation of offshore investment arrangements systematic analysis of income manipulation strategies, comprehensive business valuation reports, and expert testimony regarding the legal implications of David's asset protection planning. The presentation demonstrated not only the existence of concealed assets, but also the systematic and deliberate nature of David's efforts to manipulate the divorce proceeding. Catherine Walsh's review of Victoria's evidence file revealed the most comprehensive matrimonial asset investigation she had encountered during her extensive legal career. The quality of documentation, the sophistication of analytical methods, and the scope of expert support exceeded anything she had previously seen in complex divorce cases involving sophisticated asset concealment strategy. Morrison's expert analysis provided Catherine with professional assessment, confirming that David's financial arrangements violated multiple aspects of California family law and potentially constituted criminal fraud in addition to civil violation. The expert testimony available to Victoria's legal team would enable them to present compelling arguments for maximum settlement terms while establishing clear evidence of systematic deception and asset concealment. Elena's international asset investigation provided Catherine with evidence of offshore arrangements that could be traced and potentially recovered through specialized legal strategies that extended beyond traditional matrimonial proceedings. The international scope of David's asset concealment created additional legal vulnerabilities that could result in significant financial penalties and enhanced settlement obligations. Thomas's business valuation analysis demonstrated that David's representations regarding Sterling and Associates significantly understated the firm's actual value, creating additional evidence of systematic financial manipulation. The valuation discrepancy provided compelling arguments for enhanced settlement terms while establishing clear patterns of deceptive financial reporting. Catherine Walsh's private consultation with David, following her review of Victoria's evidence, marked a crucial moment in the progression of their divorce proceeding. Her assessment of the legal implications and potential consequences of continued litigation led to frank discussions about the advisability of pursuing aggressive strategies against evidence that appeared overwhelming and comprehensive. The psychological impact of discovering the extent of Victoria's evidence compilation created significant pressure on both David and his legal counsel to reassess their initial strategy and consider settlement alternatives that would avoid the public disclosure and legal consequences that would result from continued litigation. Catherine's recognition that Victoria's case was far stronger than initially assessed led to urgent discussions about damage control and settlement strategy. Victoria's transformation from underestimated spouse to formidable legal adversary had been accomplished through systematic preparation that exceeded the analytical capabilities typically available in matrimonial proceedings. Her evidence compilation had created strategic advantages that opposing counsel could not effectively counter through traditional litigation tactics or procedural maneuvering. The strategic revelation phase demonstrated that comprehensive preparation and expert collaboration could overcome significant advantages in legal representation and financial resources. Victoria's systematic approach had created evidentiary foundations that would ultimately prove decisive in achieving outcomes that reflected the actual scope of marital assets rather than David's preferred representations of their financial situation. Catherine Walsh's emergency consultation with David Sterling the morning after reviewing Victoria's comprehensive evidence file represented a fundamental shift in the strategic landscape of their divorce proceeding. The aggressive attorney who had confidently assured David that his case would proceed smoothly toward a favorable resolution now faced the most challenging matrimonial dispute of her distinguished legal career. The evidence compilation that Victoria had systematically assembled over 18 months had transformed what Catherine initially assessed as a routine high-asset divorce into a complex legal minefield that threatened both her professional reputation and her client's financial position. The private conference room at Walsh & Associates bore witness to increasingly desperate strategy sessions as Catherine attempted to identify viable approaches for responding to evidence that systematically dismantled every aspect of David's preferred narrative regarding their marital asset. The mahogany table that had hosted countless successful case planning meetings now served as the staging area for damage control discussions that revealed the extent to which Victoria's analytical capabilities had exceeded all expectations.
Catherine's review of the offshore investment documentation that Elena Vasquez had traced through international financial networks revealed asset concealment strategies that violated multiple aspects of California family law, while potentially creating criminal liability under federal financial disclosure requirements. The sophisticated nature of these arrangements indicated professional coordination that would be difficult to characterize as inadvertent oversight or innocent tax planning, rather than deliberate matrimonial fraud. The international asset structures documented in opposing counsel's evidence file represent systematic planning that began years before any formal marital difficulties became apparent, Catherine informed David during their emergency consultation. The timing and coordination of these arrangements creates compelling evidence that you anticipated divorce proceedings while maintaining the public appearance of marital commitment and partnership. David's response to Catherine's assessment reflected the psychological shock of discovering that his carefully constructed asset protection strategies had been comprehensively documented and analyzed by someone he had consistently underestimated. His assumption that Victoria lacked the analytical capabilities necessary to understand complex financial arrangements had been fundamentally undermined by evidence that demonstrated sophisticated forensic accounting expertise and systematic investigative methodology. The business valuation analysis prepared by Thomas Chen presented additional challenges for Catherine's defensive strategy. The comprehensive assessment of Sterling and Associates revealed that David's internal financial statements significantly understated the firm's actual value through accounting methods and revenue recognition practices that were inconsistent with standard business valuation principles. The magnitude of the valuation discrepancy created compelling evidence of systematic financial manipulation designed to minimize settlement obligation. Catherine's experience with complex matrimonial asset disputes had taught her to anticipate certain types of evidence and to develop counter-arguments that could minimize the impact of adverse financial documentation. However, Victoria's evidence compilation exceeded the scope of typical matrimonial investigations by combining forensic accounting analysis, international asset tracing, business valuation expertise, and legal precedent research into a comprehensive case file that addressed every potential defensive strategy that opposing counsel might employ. Morrison's forensic accounting analysis provided Victoria's legal team with expert testimony that would be compelling to family court judges who possessed limited experience with sophisticated asset concealment strategy. His professional assessment confirmed that David's financial arrangements violated fiduciary obligations to his spouse, while demonstrating systematic planning designed to manipulate divorce proceedings through deliberate asset concealment and income manipulation. The psychological pressure created by Victoria's evidence compilation extended beyond the immediate legal implications to include potential consequences for David's professional reputation and business relationships. The documentation of systematic financial manipulation and potential matrimonial fraud could result in regulatory investigations, professional sanctions, and damage to the industry relationships that had enabled Sterling and Associates to achieve its prominent market position. Catherine's assessment of the broader implications of Victoria's evidence led to urgent discussions with David regarding the advisability of continuing aggressive litigation strategies that would result in public disclosure of asset concealment activity. The potential for enhanced media attention and regulatory scrutiny created additional incentives for pursuing settlement alternatives that would minimize public exposure while addressing Victoria's legitimate claims for fair asset division. The mounting pressure on opposing counsel became apparent during subsequent case management conferences, when Catherine's typically aggressive courtroom demeanor was replaced by more cautious approaches that reflected growing uncertainty about her ability to counter Victoria's comprehensive evidence effectively. Her requests for additional discovery time and procedural delays suggested strategic recognition that continued proceedings would likely expose additional evidence that would further compromise David's position. Margaret Chen's observation of Catherine's evolving legal strategy confirmed that Victoria's evidence compilation had achieved its intended psychological impact on opposing counsel. The systematic documentation and expert analysis had created legal advantages that could not be effectively countered through traditional litigation tactics or procedural maneuvering, forcing opposing counsel to consider settlement alternatives that would have been unthinkable during their initial assessment of the case. Victoria's personal transformation during this phase of the proceedings reflected growing confidence in both her analytical capabilities and her legal position. The validation provided by expert professionals who confirmed the quality and comprehensiveness of her evidence compilation had eliminated the self-doubt that she had experienced during the early phases of her investigation. She now understood that her systematic approach had created strategic advantages that positioned her to achieve outcomes that reflected the actual scope of marital assets rather than David's preferred representation. The collaborative relationship between Victoria and her professional alliance evolved into a sophisticated legal strategy that anticipated and countered every defensive approach that opposing counsel might employ. Dr. Morrison's forensic accounting expertise, Elena's international asset investigation capabilities, and Thomas's business valuation analysis created a comprehensive foundation for presenting evidence that would be compelling to judges while withstanding aggressive challenges from experienced matrimonial attorneys. Catherine Walsh's growing frustration with her inability to develop effective counter-strategies became apparent during discovery disputes, when her typically aggressive courtroom advocacy was tempered by recognition that continued challenges to Victoria's evidence requests would likely result in judicial sanction. The specificity and accuracy of Victoria's document demands had established clear patterns of legitimate investigation that opposing counsel could not characterize as fishing expeditions or harassment tactics. The procedural victories achieved by Victoria's legal team during discovery disputes provided additional validation of their strategic approach while creating legal obligations for David to produce documentation that would further confirm the accuracy of Victoria's independent investigation. Each successful discovery motion increased the pressure on opposing counsel while demonstrating to the court that Victoria's legal team possessed substantial factual foundations for their comprehensive document requests. David's psychological response to the mounting legal pressure reflected the profound shock of discovering that someone he had consistently dismissed possessed analytical capabilities that exceeded his own understanding of their financial situation. His confidence in his ability to control the divorce proceedings through superior legal representation and financial sophistication had been systematically undermined by evidence that revealed the full scope of his asset concealment strategies. The emergency strategy sessions between David and Catherine Walsh increasingly focused on damage control rather than achieving favorable settlement terms. The comprehensiveness of Victoria's evidence had transformed their legal objectives from pursuing maximum advantage to minimizing potential criminal liability and professional consequences that could result from continued exposure of systematic asset concealment activity. Catherine's consultation with additional legal specialists confirmed that Victoria's evidence compilation represented the most sophisticated matrimonial asset investigation she had encountered during her extensive career. The quality of documentation, the comprehensiveness of analytical methods, and the scope of expert support exceeded the capabilities typically available in even the most well-resourced divorce proceedings, creating legal challenges that traditional matrimonial defense strategies could not address effectively. The international scope of Victoria's asset investigation created additional complications for Catherine's defensive strategy. Elena's documentation of offshore arrangements and international business relationships established clear patterns of asset concealment that violated both California family law requirements and federal financial disclosure obligations. The potential for parallel criminal investigations and regulatory enforcement actions created urgency for resolving the case through settlement negotiations rather than continued litigation. Victoria's evidence compilation had also revealed systematic coordination between David and professional advisors who had assisted with asset protection planning, while David maintained the pretense of marital normalcy. The documentation of these collaborative relationships provided additional evidence of deliberate planning, while creating potential liability for professional advisors who had participated in arrangements that violated matrimonial disclosure requirements. The mounting pressure on opposing counsel culminated in Catherine's recognition that continued aggressive litigation would likely result in outcomes that exceeded Victoria's initial settlement demands, while exposing David to potential criminal liability and professional sanction. Her legal strategy evolved from pursuing favorable terms to negotiating damage control arrangements that would minimize the broader consequences of systematic asset concealment. Margaret Chen's strategic patience during this phase reflected confidence that time favored Victoria's position as additional evidence continued to emerge through formal discovery procedures. Each document produced by opposing counsel confirmed details that Victoria had independently identified while revealing additional asset concealment strategies that had not been included in David's initial financial disclosures. The psychological transformation of the legal dynamics, apparent during settlement discussions, when Catherine Walsh began exploring resolution alternatives that would acknowledge the legitimacy of Victoria's asset claims, while attempting to minimize the public disclosure and legal consequences that would result from continued litigation. Her shift from aggressive denial to damage control negotiation reflected institutional recognition that Victoria's evidence could not be effectively challenged through traditional matrimonial defense strategy. Victoria's systematic approach to evidence compilation had created legal advantages that exceeded what opposing counsel could counter through superior resources or procedural sophistication. The comprehensive nature of her investigation had anticipated and addressed every potential defensive strategy, while establishing expert validation that would be compelling to judges and mediators who would evaluate her claims during formal proceedings. The mounting pressure phase demonstrated that thorough preparation and analytical excellence could overcome significant institutional advantages when combined with strategic patience and professional collaboration. Victoria's transformation from underestimated spouse to formidable legal adversary had been accomplished through systematic work that created evidentiary foundations, exceeding what opposing counsel could effectively challenge or minimize through traditional litigation tactics. Catherine Walsh's evolving assessment of Victoria's case reflected the broader implications of comprehensive preparation combined with expert analysis and strategic presentation. The evidence compilation had created legal realities that could not be altered through aggressive advocacy or procedural maneuvering, forcing opposing counsel to confront the fundamental weakness of their client's position when subjected to systematic investigation and expert scrutiny. Catherine Walsh's emergency partners meeting at Walsh & Associates convened at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after her comprehensive review of Victoria Sterling's evidence file. The senior conference room, typically reserved for celebrating major legal victories and strategic planning sessions, now served as the venue for discussions that would determine whether the firm's most prominent matrimonial attorney would continue representing David Sterling or withdraw from the most challenging case of her distinguished career. The gravity of the situation became apparent as Catherine presented her analysis to the firm's managing partner. Her reputation as an aggressive litigator who had never encountered a matrimonial case she could not manage through strategic maneuvering and superior legal advocacy now faced its most significant test. Victoria Sterling's systematic evidence compilation had created legal complexities that exceeded the scope of traditional matrimonial defense strategies, while potentially exposing both David and his legal counsel to professional liability that could damage the firm's reputation. Senior partner Robert Walsh listened intently as Catherine outlined the scope of evidence that Victoria's investigative team had compiled regarding David's asset concealment strategy. The international offshore arrangements, systematic business valuation, manipulation, and documented coordination with professional advisors created a pattern of deliberate matrimonial fraud that would be difficult to defend through conventional legal arguments or procedural challenge. The evidence presented by opposing counsel demonstrates systematic planning and coordination that began years before any formal marital difficulties became apparent, Catherine explained to the partners meeting. The comprehensiveness and professional quality of their investigation exceeds anything we have encountered in complex matrimonial proceedings,
creating legal challenges that traditional defense strategies cannot address effectively. The financial implications of continuing representation became a central focus of the partners' meeting, as Catherine outlined the potential costs and professional risks associated with defending a case that involved clear evidence of systematic asset concealment and possible criminal violation. The time requirements for developing adequate responses to Victoria's evidence would strain the firm's resources, while potentially exposing the legal team to professional liability if they continued representing a client whose conduct violated ethical and legal standards. Managing partner Patricia Chen raised concerns about the broader implications for the firm's reputation and professional relationships. Walsh & Associates had built its prominence through successful representation of high-net-worth clients in complex matrimonial proceedings, but that reputation depended on maintaining ethical standards and avoiding association with cases that involved clear evidence of systematic fraud or professional misconduct. Our professional obligations require us to consider whether continued representation would compromise our ethical responsibilities or expose the firm to liability for participating in proceedings that involve documented evidence of systematic asset concealment, Patricia observed during the partners' meeting. The quality and comprehensiveness of opposing counsel's evidence suggests that this case involves more than typical matrimonial asset dispute. Catherine's analysis of the legal precedents and professional liability implications confirmed that continued representation of David Sterling could create significant risks for both her individual practice and the firm's collective reputation. The evidence that Victoria had compiled established clear patterns of deliberate asset concealment that would be difficult to characterize as inadvertent oversight or legitimate business planning, rather than systematic matrimonial fraud. The ethical considerations surrounding continued representation became more complex as Catherine acknowledged that her initial assessment of Victoria's case had been fundamentally flawed. Her confidence in David's ability to achieve favorable settlement terms had been based on assumptions about Victoria's limited understanding of their financial situation, assumptions that had been proven completely incorrect by the comprehensive evidence compilation that opposing counsel had presented. Morrison's forensic accounting analysis provided expert testimony that would be compelling to family court judges, while establishing clear evidence that David's financial arrangements violated multiple aspects of California family law. The professional quality of this analysis exceeded the expertise typically available in matrimonial proceedings, creating evidentiary standards that Catherine's defensive strategies could not effectively challenge or minimize. Elena Vasquez's international asset investigation had documented offshore arrangements and business relationships that created potential criminal liability under federal financial disclosure requirements. The sophistication and systematic nature of these arrangements indicated professional coordination that would be difficult to defend through arguments about inadvertent oversight or innocent tax planning strategy. Thomas Chen's business valuation analysis demonstrated that David's representations regarding Sterling and Associates significantly understated the firm's actual value through accounting methods that were inconsistent with standard valuation principles. The magnitude of this valuation discrepancy created additional evidence of systematic financial manipulation that would support Victoria's claims for enhanced settlement terms, while establishing patterns of deceptive financial reporting. The cumulative impact of Victoria's evidence compilation created legal challenges that exceeded Catherine's ability to develop effective counter-strategies through traditional matrimonial defense approaches. Her experience with aggressive litigation tactics and procedural maneuvering provided no adequate responses to evidence that was both comprehensive and professionally validated by recognized experts in forensic accounting, international asset investigation, and business valuation. Catherine's consultation with external legal specialists confirmed that Victoria's evidence represented the most sophisticated matrimonial asset investigation they had encountered in their collective professional experience. The analytical methods, documentation quality, and expert validation exceeded the capabilities typically available in even the most well-resourced divorce proceedings, creating evidentiary foundations that would be virtually impossible to challenge effectively. The partners' meeting discussion increasingly focused on the practical implications of withdrawal versus continued representation. Catherine's analysis indicated that withdrawal would enable the firm to avoid potential professional liability while preserving their reputation for ethical practice. Continued representation would require enormous resource commitments, with minimal probability of achieving favorable outcomes for David, while creating significant risks for the firm's professional standing. Robert Walsh's assessment of the situation reflected both concern for Catherine's professional reputation and recognition that the firm's collective interests required careful consideration of the ethical and practical implications of continued representation. His experience with complex litigation had taught him to recognize cases where withdrawal represented the most prudent, strategic decision, despite potential disappointment to valued clients. The evidence presented by opposing counsel creates professional obligations that we cannot ignore regardless of our loyalty to long-standing clients, Robert explained during the partners' meeting. Our ethical responsibilities require us to consider whether continued representation would compromise our professional integrity or expose the firm to liability for participating in proceedings that involve documented evidence of systematic misconduct. Catherine's growing recognition that withdrawal represented the most appropriate response to Victoria's evidence reflected both professional integrity and practical assessment of the legal realities that comprehensive preparation had created. Her initial confidence in David's case had been based on assumptions about typical matrimonial proceedings that had been fundamentally undermined by the sophistication and comprehensiveness of Victoria's investigative approach. The psychological impact of acknowledging professional limitations in the face of superior preparation and analysis created profound effects on Catherine's understanding of matrimonial practice and client assessment procedures. Victoria Sterling's systematic evidence compilation had demonstrated analytical capabilities that exceeded what Catherine had encountered during decades of complex litigation, creating educational experiences that would influence her approach to future cases. Margaret Chen's strategic patience during this phase reflected confidence that time favored Victoria's position, as opposing counsel struggled to develop adequate responses to evidence that systematically addressed every potential defensive strategy. The mounting pressure on Catherine Walsh demonstrated that comprehensive preparation, combined with expert analysis, could overcome significant advantages in legal representation and professional connections. Victoria's transformation from underestimated spouse to formidable legal adversary reached its culminating moment as opposing counsel faced the reality that continued representation would likely result in professional embarrassment and potential liability, rather than the favorable outcomes that had been confidently predicted during initial case assessment. The analytical capabilities that David had consistently dismissed were now creating legal consequences that his expensive legal representation could not effectively counter or minimize. The crisis point for opposing counsel reflected broader principles about the relationship between preparation and outcomes in complex legal proceedings. Victoria's systematic approach had created evidentiary foundations that exceeded what traditional litigation strategies could challenge, demonstrating that analytical excellence and comprehensive investigation could triumph over institutional advantages and superior financial resources. Catherine Walsh's ultimate decision regarding continued representation would establish important precedents about professional obligations and ethical responsibilities when confronted with evidence of systematic client misconduct. Her recognition that Victoria's evidence compilation exceeded her ability to develop adequate defensive responses represented acknowledgement that comprehensive preparation had created legal realities that could not be altered through traditional advocacy approaches. The mounting crisis within Walsh and Associates reflected the broader implications of Victoria's systematic approach to evidence compilation and legal strategy development. Her transformation from overlooked spouse to expert matrimonial investigator had created professional challenges that experienced attorneys were unable to address through conventional litigation tactics or procedural maneuvering. David Sterling's psychological response to the crisis facing his legal representation reflected growing awareness that his carefully constructed asset protection strategies had been comprehensively exposed and analyzed by someone whose capabilities he had fundamentally underestimated. The mounting pressure on his legal counsel indicated that his preferred narrative regarding their financial situation could not be sustained when subjected to systematic investigation and expert scrutiny. The crisis point represented validation of Victoria's analytical approach and strategic patience. Her systematic evidence compilation had created legal advantages that could not be overcome through superior legal representation or aggressive litigation tactics, demonstrating that thorough preparation and expert analysis could achieve outcomes that reflected actual circumstances rather than manipulated representations of financial reality. Catherine Walsh's recognition that withdrawal might represent her most prudent option reflected institutional acknowledgement that Victoria's evidence compilation had achieved its intended strategic purpose. The comprehensive nature of the investigation had created legal challenges that exceeded what traditional matrimonial defense strategies could address effectively, forcing opposing counsel to confront the fundamental weakness of their client's position when subjected to systematic analysis and expert validation. Catherine Walsh's withdrawal motion arrived at the family court clerk's office on Thursday morning at precisely 9 o'clock, representing the most significant professional acknowledgement of defeat in her 23-year career as a matrimonial attorney. The formal legal document, drafted with the careful precision that characterized all communications from Walsh and Associates, contained the standard procedural language required for attorney withdrawal, while concealing the extraordinary circumstances that had forced one of the state's most aggressive divorce lawyers to abandon a case she had initially approached with supreme confidence. The withdrawal motion itself represented more than a tactical retreat from challenging litigation. Catherine's decision to cease representation of David Sterling constituted institutional recognition that Victoria's evidence compilation had created legal complexities that exceeded the scope of traditional matrimonial defense strategies, while potentially exposing both client and counsel to professional liability that could result in significant financial and reputational consequences. Margaret Chen received notification of the withdrawal motion within hours of its filing, providing confirmation that Victoria's systematic evidence compilation had achieved its intended strategic impact on opposing counsel. The timing of Catherine's withdrawal, occurring just days before critical discovery deadlines and procedural requirements, indicated that her decision had been precipitated by immediate crisis rather than gradual strategic reassessment of case dynamics. The professional implications of Catherine's withdrawal extended throughout the matrimonial law community, where news of her decision generated speculation about the extraordinary circumstances that could force such an experienced and aggressive advocate to abandon a high-profile case. Her reputation had been built through successful representation of sophisticated clients in complex asset disputes, making her withdrawal from the Sterling case particularly noteworthy among colleagues who understood the financial and professional costs associated with such decisions. David Sterling's initial response to Catherine's withdrawal reflected both shock and growing panic as he confronted the reality that his most trusted legal advisor had concluded that continued representation was no longer professionally viable. The attorney who had confidently assured him that Victoria possessed no realistic prospects for favorable settlement terms had been forced to withdraw after discovering evidence that systematically undermined every aspect of his preferred financial narrative. The formal withdrawal hearing provided Margaret Chen with the opportunity to demonstrate the strength of Victoria's legal position, while establishing procedural advantages that would benefit her client during subsequent proceedings. The court's acceptance of Catherine's withdrawal motion implicitly acknowledged that legitimate professional conflicts had emerged from the evidence presented during discovery, creating judicial recognition of the substance and significance of Victoria's investigative work. Judge Rebecca Morrison's questions during the withdrawal hearing reflected both curiosity about the unusual circumstances and concern about potential delays that might result from David's need to secure alternative representation. Her experience with complex matrimonial cases had taught her to recognize withdrawal patterns that indicated substantive problems with client positions, rather than routine professional conflicts or fee disputes. Catherine Walsh's responses to judicial inquiries maintained the diplomatic professionalism required by court proceedings, while carefully avoiding specific references to the evidence that had precipitated her withdrawal decision. Her statements emphasized irreconcilable differences regarding litigation strategy and case direction, without explicitly acknowledging that Victoria's evidence compilation had proven overwhelming to her defensive capabilities. The parties have developed fundamental disagreements regarding case strategy and settlement objectives that prevent effective representation, Catherine informed Judge Morrison during the withdrawal hearing.
Professional ethical considerations require withdrawal when such conflicts compromise the ability to provide adequate advocacy within appropriate legal and professional standards. The judicial acceptance of Catherine's withdrawal created immediate procedural complications for David Sterling, who faced upcoming discovery deadlines and court appearances without legal representation. The timing of the withdrawal had been strategically calculated to minimize Catherine's exposure to continued proceedings, while maximizing the disruption to David's legal strategy and procedural compliance obligations. Margaret Chen's strategic response to opposing counsel's withdrawal reflected careful preparation for contingencies that might arise from Victoria's comprehensive evidence presentation. Rather than seeking immediate tactical advantages from David's temporary lack of representation, Margaret pursued long-term strategic objectives that would ensure sustained pressure for complete asset disclosure and fair settlement terms. Victoria's personal response to Catherine Walsh's withdrawal provided profound validation of the analytical approach and systematic preparation that had characterized her evidence compilation efforts. The most aggressive matrimonial attorney in the state had been forced to acknowledge that Victoria's investigative work had created legal challenges that exceeded her ability to provide adequate defensive representation through traditional litigation strategies. The psychological transformation that Victoria experienced during this phase reflected growing confidence in both her analytical capabilities and her strategic judgment. The validation provided by opposing counsel's withdrawal confirmed that her systematic approach to evidence compilation had achieved professional recognition from experienced legal practitioners who understood the complexities and challenges of sophisticated matrimonial asset disputes. Dr. Morrison's analysis of the withdrawal implications provided expert assessment that Catherine's decision reflected rational professional judgment rather than procedural maneuvering or strategic positioning. His experience with complex forensic accounting cases had taught him to recognize withdrawal patterns that indicated substantive evidentiary problems rather than routine professional conflicts or client relationship difficulties. Experienced matrimonial attorneys typically withdraw from cases only when continued representation would compromise their professional obligations or expose them to potential liability for participating in proceedings that involve clear evidence of systematic misconduct. Morrison explained during his consultation with Victoria's legal team, Catherine Walsh's withdrawal indicates professional recognition that your evidence compilation has created legal realities that traditional defense strategies cannot adequately address. Alina Vasquez's assessment of the withdrawal timing confirmed that Catherine's decision had been precipitated by specific discoveries, rather than gradual strategic reassessment. The international asset investigation had revealed offshore arrangements and business relationships that created potential criminal liability under federal financial disclosure requirements, establishing legal complexities that exceeded the scope of typical matrimonial defense strategy. Thomas Chen's business valuation analysis had provided additional evidence that David's financial representations were systematically inconsistent with standard valuation principles and professional accounting practices. The magnitude of these discrepancies created compelling arguments for enhanced settlement terms, while establishing clear patterns of deceptive financial reporting that would be difficult to defend through conventional legal argument. The search for alternative legal representation created additional challenges for David Sterling as potential counsel reviewed the evidence file that had precipitated Catherine Walsh's withdrawal. The comprehensiveness and professional quality of Victoria's investigation discouraged many experienced matrimonial attorneys from accepting representation in a case that appeared to involve clear evidence of systematic asset concealment and potential criminal violation. Several prominent matrimonial law firms declined representation after reviewing the evidence that Victoria's team had compiled regarding David's financial arrangements and asset concealment strategy. The professional reputation, risks, and resource requirements associated with defending against such comprehensive evidence exceeded what most attorneys were willing to undertake, regardless of potential fee arrangements or client relationships. The attorneys who expressed willingness to consider David's representation generally lacked the experience and professional standing necessary to counter Victoria's evidence effectively. The sophisticated analytical methods and expert validation that characterized Victoria's investigation required defensive strategies that exceeded the capabilities of less experienced matrimonial practitioners, creating additional disadvantages for David's negotiating position. Margaret Chen's strategic patience during David's search for alternative representation reflected confidence that time favored Victoria's position, while creating additional pressure for settlement discussions that would acknowledge the legitimacy of her asset claim. The mounting procedural complications and legal costs associated with securing adequate representation provided additional incentives for David to consider resolution alternatives that would minimize public disclosure and legal consequences. Victoria's evidence compilation had created a situation where David faced increasingly limited options for achieving favorable outcomes through continued litigation. The withdrawal of his most trusted legal counsel had eliminated the strategic advantages that aggressive representation might have provided while exposing him to potential sanctions and enhanced settlement obligations if he failed to comply with discovery requirements and procedural deadlines. The broader implications of Catherine Walsh's withdrawal extended beyond the immediate case to influence how matrimonial attorneys approached evidence assessment and client evaluation procedures. Victoria's systematic investigation had demonstrated analytical capabilities that exceeded what most legal practitioners encountered during routine matrimonial proceedings, creating educational experiences that would influence professional standards and case preparation methodology. The professional recognition that Victoria's evidence compilation had achieved through opposing counsel's withdrawal provided validation that extended beyond the immediate legal proceedings to confirm her transformation from underestimated spouse to expert matrimonial investigator. Her analytical capabilities had been acknowledged by experienced legal professionals who understood the complexities and challenges of sophisticated asset concealment strategy. Margaret Chen's coordination with Victoria's expert team ensured that the strategic advantages created by opposing counsel's withdrawal would be leveraged effectively during subsequent proceedings. The momentum generated by Catherine's acknowledgement of evidentiary strength provided opportunities for pursuing maximum settlement terms, while maintaining pressure for complete asset disclosure and fair division of marital property. The withdrawal phase demonstrated that comprehensive preparation and expert analysis could achieve recognition from institutional adversaries who possessed significant professional experience and legal sophistication. Victoria's systematic approach had created evidentiary foundations that experienced attorneys could not effectively challenge through traditional litigation tactics or procedural maneuver. David Sterling's growing isolation from professional support systems reflected the broader consequences of systematic asset concealment when subjected to comprehensive investigation and expert analysis. His assumption that financial sophistication and aggressive legal representation would enable favorable outcomes had been undermined by evidence that revealed the true scope of his matrimonial obligations and potential legal liability. The crisis created by Catherine Walsh's withdrawal marked a decisive turning point in the Sterling divorce proceeding. Victoria's transformation from overlooked spouse to formidable legal adversary had achieved institutional recognition through the withdrawal of opposing counsel, who possessed extensive experience with complex matrimonial asset disputes. The analytical capabilities that David had consistently dismissed were now creating legal consequences that his expensive professional representation could no longer effectively counter or minimize. Catherine Walsh's withdrawal represented more than tactical acknowledgement of evidentiary strength. Her decision constituted professional validation of Victoria's systematic approach to matrimonial asset investigation, while demonstrating that comprehensive preparation could overcome significant advantages in legal representation and financial resources. The overlooked spouse had become the dominant force in proceedings that would establish new standards for evidence compilation and strategic preparation in complex matrimonial cases. David Sterling's frantic search for alternative legal representation revealed the extent to which Victoria's comprehensive evidence compilation had fundamentally altered the professional assessment of his divorce case within the matrimonial law community. The prestigious law firms that had previously competed for his business now approached his inquiries with unprecedented caution, conducting preliminary case evaluations that consistently reached the same conclusion. Representing David Sterling would require enormous resource commitments with minimal probability of achieving favorable outcomes while creating significant professional liability risk. The morning after Catherine Walsh's withdrawal became public record, David began contacting the most prominent matrimonial attorneys in the state, confident that his financial resources and professional connections would enable him to secure representation that could counter Victoria's evidence effectively. His initial conversations with senior partners at established law firms reflected his continued belief that superior legal counsel could overcome the challenges that had precipitated Catherine's withdrawal through strategic advocacy and procedural sophistication. Harrison and Associates, widely regarded as the most prestigious matrimonial law firm in California, agreed to conduct a preliminary case assessment after David's personal referral from longtime business associate Robert Chen. Senior partner Michael Harrison had built his reputation through successful representation of celebrities and high-net-worth executives in complex divorce proceedings, creating confidence that his expertise could address whatever challenges had overwhelmed Catherine Walsh's defensive strategy. Michael Harrison's review of Victoria's evidence file provided the first indication that David's optimism regarding alternative representation might be misplaced. The comprehensive nature of the documentation, combined with the professional quality of expert analysis and international asset investigation, exceeded anything Harrison had encountered during his extensive career in complex matrimonial litigation. His preliminary assessment confirmed that Victoria's evidence compilation represented systematic planning and analytical sophistication that would require unprecedented defensive resources to challenge effectively. The evidence presented by opposing counsel demonstrates investigative capabilities and analytical depth that significantly exceed typical matrimonial asset disputes, Harrison informed David during their consultation meeting. The comprehensiveness of their documentation and the professional quality of expert validation create legal challenges that would require enormous resource commitments with uncertain prospects for achieving favorable resolution through traditional litigation strategy. Represent David reflected both practical assessment of resource requirements and professional recognition that the evidence Victoria had compiled established clear patterns of systematic asset concealment that would be difficult to defend through conventional legal argument. His withdrawal from consideration represented the first indication that David's assumption about securing adequate replacement counsel might prove problematic. The subsequent rejections from other prominent matrimonial law firms followed similar patterns as experienced attorneys reviewed Victoria's evidence compilation and reached consistent conclusions about the professional risks and resource requirements associated with defending against such comprehensive documentation. Each declination reinforced David's growing understanding that Catherine Walsh's withdrawal had not been an isolated professional decision, but rather reflected industry-wide recognition of the extraordinary circumstances that Victoria's investigation had created. Brennan and Partners, specialist in high-asset divorce cases involving complex business valuations,
conducted an extensive preliminary assessment before declining representation based on their analysis of Thomas Chen's business valuation documentation. The firm's senior partners concluded that defending against such professionally comprehensive valuation analysis would require expert testimony and technical resources that exceeded the probable financial benefits of representation, while creating potential professional liability if their defensive strategies proved inadequate. Senior partner Jennifer Brennan's assessment provided David with brutal honesty regarding the strength of Victoria's position and the limited options available for challenging evidence that had been professionally validated by recognized experts in forensic accounting, international asset investigation, and business valuation. Her analysis confirmed that traditional matrimonial defense strategies would be inadequate for countering the systematic approach that Victoria's team had employed. Your wife's evidence compilation represents the most sophisticated matrimonial asset investigation we have encountered in our collective professional experience, Brennan explained during David's consultation. The analytical methods, expert validation, and comprehensive documentation, evidentiary foundations that would be virtually impossible to challenge effectively through conventional litigation approaches while potentially exposing any defending counsel to professional liability for participating in proceedings that involve clear evidence of systematic asset concealment. The pattern of rejections from established matrimonial law firms created mounting pressure on David to consider representation from less experienced attorneys who might be willing to accept the professional risks and resource challenges that prominent firms had deemed unacceptable. However, David's growing understanding of Victoria's evidence quality led him to recognize that inadequate legal representation would likely result in even worse outcomes than the settlement terms that experienced counsel had indicated might be necessary to resolve the case. David's consultation with Rodriguez and Associates, a smaller firm that specialized in defending complex financial fraud cases, provided additional perspective on the criminal liability implications that Victoria's evidence had exposed. Senior partner Carlos Rodriguez confirmed that the offshore asset arrangements and systematic financial manipulation documented in Victoria's investigation could result in federal criminal charges, in addition to the civil violations that were already established through family court proceedings. The international asset structures and systematic income manipulation documented in opposing counsel's evidence file create potential criminal liability under federal financial disclosure requirements and tax fraud statutes, Rodriguez explained during his assessment of David's situation. Any attorney representing you would need to consider whether continued litigation might expose both client and counsel to criminal prosecution, in addition to the civil consequences that are already apparent from the family court proceeding. Rodriguez's assessment confirmed that Victoria's evidence compilation had created legal complications that extended far beyond typical matrimonial asset disputes to include potential criminal violations that could result in federal prosecution and significant financial penalties. The scope of these additional legal risks made David's case even less attractive to experienced counsel while creating urgency for resolution through settlement negotiations that would minimize criminal exposure. The mounting rejections from qualified legal counsel created psychological pressure that forced David to confront the reality that his carefully constructed asset protection strategies had been comprehensively exposed by someone whose analytical capabilities he had fundamentally underestimated. His confidence in his ability to control the divorce proceedings through superior legal representation had been systematically undermined by evidence that revealed the full scope of his financial manipulation and potential legal violation. Margaret Chen's strategic monitoring of David's search for replacement counsel provided valuable intelligence regarding the assessment that experienced matrimonial attorneys were making of Victoria's evidence compilation. The consistent pattern of declinations from prominent law firms confirmed that Victoria's systematic investigation had achieved recognition within the professional legal community as evidence that exceeded the scope of typical matrimonial defense capability. Victoria's personal response to the mounting evidence of David's difficulty securing adequate legal representation provided profound validation of the systematic approach and comprehensive preparation that had characterized her investigation effort. The recognition that her analytical work had achieved professional acknowledgement from experienced legal practitioners throughout the matrimonial law community confirmed the transformation from underestimated spouse to expert investigator whose capabilities exceeded institutional expectations. The desperation, evident in David's increasingly broad search for legal representation, reflected his growing recognition that the asset concealment strategies he had implemented with such confidence were now creating legal liabilities that experienced counsel considered indefensible. His assumption that financial resources and professional connections would enable favorable outcomes had been proven incorrect by evidence that systematically documented violations of both civil and criminal law. Morrison's analysis of the professional community's response to Victoria's evidence provided expert assessment that the consistent pattern of attorney withdrawal and declination reflected rational professional judgment rather than coordinated professional boycott or strategic maneuvering. His experience with complex forensic accounting cases had taught him to recognize evidence quality that exceeded what most legal practitioners encountered during routine proceedings. The consistent response from experienced matrimonial counsel reflects professional recognition that your evidence compilation has established legal realities that traditional defense strategies cannot adequately address, Dr. Morrison explained during his consultation with Victoria's team. The quality of documentation and expert validation creates evidentiary foundations that experienced attorneys understand would be virtually impossible to challenge through conventional litigation approaches. Elena Vasquez's international asset investigation had revealed additional complications that made David's case even less attractive to potential counsel. The offshore arrangements and international business relationships that she had documented created jurisdictional complexities and potential criminal violations that exceeded the expertise of most matrimonial attorneys, while requiring specialized knowledge of international asset recovery and federal criminal law. Thomas Chen's business valuation analysis continued to provide compelling evidence that David's financial representations were systematically inconsistent with professional valuation standards and accepted accounting practices. The magnitude of these discrepancies created additional evidence of deliberate financial manipulation that would be difficult for any defending counsel to explain through arguments about inadvertent oversight or legitimate business planning. The comprehensive nature of Victoria's evidence compilation had created a situation where David faced the choice between accepting representation from inadequately experienced counsel or attempting to negotiate settlement terms that would acknowledge the legitimacy of Victoria's asset claims while minimizing criminal exposure and professional consequences. Both alternatives represented significant departures from the favorable outcomes that David had confidently anticipated when initiating divorce proceedings. The crisis in securing adequate legal representation forced David to confront fundamental questions about the sustainability of his asset concealment strategies when subjected to systematic investigation by someone who possessed sophisticated analytical capability. His assumption that Victoria lacked the expertise necessary to understand complex financial arrangements had been proven catastrophically incorrect by evidence that exceeded the comprehensiveness typically available in even the most well-resourced matrimonial proceedings. Margaret Chen's strategic patience during David's search for alternative counsel reflected confidence that time continued to favor Victoria's position, while creating additional pressure for settlement discussions that would reflect the actual scope of marital assets rather than David's preferred representation. The mounting procedural complications and escalating legal costs associated with David's search for adequate representation provided additional incentives for pursuing resolution alternatives that would minimize public disclosure and criminal liability. The desperate search phase demonstrated that comprehensive preparation and expert analysis could create legal realities that could not be overcome through superior financial resources or professional connections. Victoria's systematic approach had achieved recognition within the professional community as evidence that exceeded the capabilities of traditional matrimonial defense strategies while establishing new standards for investigative thoroughness and analytical sophistication in complex asset disputes. David Sterling's growing isolation from adequate professional representation reflected the broader consequences of systematic asset concealment when subjected to comprehensive investigation and expert validation. His confidence in his ability to manipulate divorce proceedings through financial sophistication and aggressive legal advocacy had been undermined by evidence that revealed the true scope of his matrimonial obligations and potential criminal liability. The transformation of David's position from confident aggressor to desperate defendant seeking any available legal counsel demonstrated the power of thorough preparation and analytical excellence to overcome significant institutional advantages. Victoria's evidence compilation had created professional recognition that her systematic investigation exceeded the quality typically encountered in complex matrimonial proceedings while establishing legal foundations that experienced counsel understood would be virtually impossible to challenge effectively through traditional litigation approaches. David Sterling's eventual acceptance of representation from Anderson and Liu, a relatively inexperienced matrimonial law firm, represented a profound departure from the sophisticated legal counsel he had originally secured for his divorce proceeding. The firm's willingness to accept his case reflected both their limited experience with complex asset concealment investigations and their failure to fully comprehend the scope of evidence that Victoria's systematic compilation had created. Senior partner James Anderson possessed adequate credentials for routine matrimonial cases, but lacked the specialized expertise necessary to counter the forensic accounting analysis, international asset investigation, and business valuation documentation that Victoria's team had assembled. The preliminary strategy sessions between David and his new legal counsel revealed the fundamental mismatch between the defensive capabilities that Anderson and Liu could provide and the sophisticated evidence compilation that they would need to address during formal proceedings. James Anderson's initial confidence in his ability to challenge Victoria's claims reflected his inexperience with cases involving systematic asset concealment and professional expert validation, rather than realistic assessment of the legal challenges that comprehensive evidence had created. Anderson's review of Victoria's evidence file provided his first indication that the case involved complexities that exceeded his firm's typical experience with matrimonial asset disputes. The forensic accounting analysis, prepared by Dr. Morrison, demonstrated systematic financial manipulation that Anderson had never encountered during his limited practice in complex divorce proceedings. The international asset investigation, conducted by Elena Vasquez, revealed offshore arrangements and business relationships that required specialized knowledge of international financial law and asset recovery procedures that Anderson's firm did not possess. The business valuation analysis, completed by Thomas Chen, established professional standards for asset assessment that exceeded Anderson's ability to challenge through conventional litigation approaches. The comprehensive nature of the valuation methodology and the systematic documentation of David's financial misrepresentations created evidentiary foundations that Anderson could not effectively counter without access to equally sophisticated expert testimony and analytical resources. Margaret Chen's strategic assessment of David's new legal representation confirmed that Anderson and Liu lacked the experience and resources necessary to mount adequate defensive strategies against Victoria's evidence compilation. Her analysis indicated that David's decision to accept representation from an inadequately prepared law firm would likely result in procedural errors and strategic misjudgments that would further compromise his negotiating position. while creating additional opportunities for Victoria's team to demonstrate the strength of their evidence. The first case management conference following Anderson's entry into the proceedings provided clear evidence of the fundamental disadvantages that David now faced in legal representation. Anderson's preparation for the hearing reflected limited understanding of the complex financial structures and asset concealment strategies that Victoria's investigation had documented. His questions regarding discovery procedures and evidence presentation demonstrated unfamiliarity with the sophisticated analytical methods that characterized Victoria's systematic approach to evidence compilation. Judge Rebecca Morrison's assessment of the new legal dynamics reflected both concern about potential delays and recognition that David's choice of counsel might create additional procedural complications during formal proceedings. Her experience with complex matrimonial cases had taught her to identify representation mismatches that could compromise case efficiency while potentially prejudicing the interests of inadequately represented parties. Anderson's first substantive response to Victoria's evidence compilation demonstrated the limitations of his defensive capabilities while confirming Margaret Chen's assessment that David's new counsel lacked the expertise necessary to challenge comprehensive forensic accounting analysis and professional expert validation. His preliminary objections to Victoria's evidence focused on procedural technicalities rather than substantive challenges to the analytical methods and documentary evidence that formed the foundation of her asset claim. The procedural errors that characterized Anderson's early case management created additional advantages for Victoria's legal team while demonstrating the consequences of David's inability to secure adequate professional representation. Anderson's failure to comply with discovery deadlines and his inadequate responses to court orders reflected both inexperience with complex litigation procedures and insufficient understanding of the evidentiary standards required for challenging professional expert testimony. Morrison's analysis of Anderson's defensive strategies confirmed that David's new counsel was attempting to employ conventional matrimonial defense approaches that were fundamentally inadequate for addressing the systematic evidence compilation that Victoria had created.
His assessment indicated that Anderson lacked both the technical expertise necessary to understand complex financial structures and the procedural sophistication required for challenging professional forensic accounting analysis through expert testimony and cross-examination. The defensive strategies being employed by opposing counsel reflect fundamental misunderstanding of both the analytical methods used in forensic accounting investigation and the evidentiary standards required for challenging professional expert testimony, Dr. Morrison explained during his consultation with Victoria's legal team. Their approach suggests inexperience with cases involving systematic asset concealment and comprehensive financial analysis. Elena Vasquez's assessment of Anderson's response to the international asset investigation revealed additional evidence of inadequate preparation and limited understanding of the jurisdictional complexities that offshore arrangements created for defensive strategies. Anderson's failure to address the criminal liability implications of David's international financial structures indicated that he lacked the specialized knowledge necessary to provide adequate counsel regarding potential federal prosecution and asset forfeiture procedures. Thomas Chen's analysis of Anderson's challenges to the business valuation documentation demonstrated that David's counsel possessed insufficient expertise in professional valuation methodologies and standard accounting practices to mount effective challenges to the comprehensive analysis that had established Sterling Associates' actual market value. Anderson's objections reflected general skepticism rather than specific technical criticisms based on professional valuation standards and accepted business analysis principles. The mounting evidence of inadequate legal representation created additional psychological pressure on David Sterling as he confronted the reality that his financial resources could not secure the professional expertise necessary to counter Victoria's systematic evidence compilation. His confidence in his ability to achieve favorable outcomes through superior legal advocacy had been undermined by the consistent pattern of attorney withdrawals and declinations that had forced him to accept representation from counsel who lacked adequate experience and specialized knowledge. Margaret Chen's strategic response to the obvious inadequacies in David's legal representation reflected both professional ethics and tactical considerations regarding the most effective approaches for presenting Victoria's evidence during formal proceeding. Her experience had taught her that overwhelming inadequately prepared opposing counsel could create procedural complications and potential appeals issues that might delay final resolution of the case. The collaboration between Victoria's expert team and her legal counsel during this phase focused on presenting evidence in ways that would be compelling to Judge Morrison, while avoiding approaches that might be characterized as taking unfair advantage of David's inadequate representation. The systematic nature of Victoria's evidence compilation enabled strategic presentation that relied on professional analysis and documentary evidence rather than aggressive advocacy or procedural maneuvering. Victoria's personal response to the obvious mismatch between her comprehensive preparation and David's inadequate legal representation provided additional validation of the systematic approach and analytical sophistication that had characterized her evidence compilation effort. The contrast between her expert team's capabilities and Anderson's limited defensive resources demonstrated the transformative power of thorough preparation and professional collaboration in complex legal proceedings. The procedural advantages that Victoria's team gained through David's inadequate representation included unopposed expert testimony, uncontested evidence presentation, simplified discovery procedures that enabled comprehensive documentation of asset concealment without significant procedural obstacles. Anderson's failure to mount effective challenges to Victoria's evidence created opportunities for establishing legal precedents regarding systematic asset concealment and matrimonial fraud that would influence future cases. Morrison's expert testimony during formal proceedings proceeded without significant challenge from Anderson, who lacked both the technical expertise necessary to understand forensic accounting methodologies and the procedural knowledge required for effective cross-examination of professional expert witnesses. The uncontested nature of Morrison's analysis provided judicial validation of Victoria's systematic investigation while establishing professional standards for evidence compilation in complex matrimonial asset disputes. Elena Vasquez's presentation of international asset investigation findings proceeded similarly without adequate challenge from David's counsel, who demonstrated limited understanding of international financial law and asset recovery procedures. Anderson's failure to address the criminal liability implications of offshore arrangements created additional legal vulnerabilities for David, while enabling Elena's testimony to establish clear patterns of systematic asset concealment that violated both civil and criminal law. Thomas Chen's business valuation testimony provided Judge Morrison with comprehensive analysis of Sterling and Associates' actual market value without significant challenge from Anderson, who lacked the expertise necessary to contest professional valuation methodologies and standard accounting practices. The uncontested nature of Thomas's analysis enabled judicial recognition of the systematic financial manipulation that David had employed to minimize apparent asset values during divorce proceedings. The cumulative impact of uncontested expert testimony created overwhelming evidence that David's asset concealment strategies violated multiple aspects of California family law, while potentially constituting criminal fraud under federal financial disclosure requirements. Anderson's inability to mount effective challenges to this evidence enabled Victoria's team to establish legal foundations for enhanced settlement terms while demonstrating the systematic nature of David's financial manipulation. Judge Morrison's assessment of the evidence presented during formal proceedings reflected both professional admiration for the quality of Victoria's investigation and concern about the apparent inadequacy of David's legal representation. Her judicial experience had taught her to recognize evidence compilation that exceeded typical matrimonial case standards, while identifying representation mismatches that might compromise procedural fairness. The mounting evidence of David's systematic asset concealment, combined with his counsel's inability to mount adequate defensive strategies, created legal momentum that favored Victoria's position, while establishing precedents for addressing sophisticated financial manipulation in matrimonial proceedings. The comprehensive nature of her evidence compilation had achieved judicial recognition as professional investigation that exceeded standard matrimonial case preparation, while demonstrating analytical capabilities that transformed understanding of complex asset disputes. Anderson's growing recognition of his inadequacy in addressing Victoria's evidence created additional pressure for settlement discussions that would acknowledge the legitimacy of her asset claims while minimizing the public disclosure and legal consequences that continued litigation would create for David. His limited experience with complex cases had not prepared him for the professional and procedural challenges that comprehensive expert testimony and systematic evidence compilation presented during formal proceedings. The inadequate defense phase demonstrated that thorough preparation and expert collaboration could achieve decisive advantages even when opposing parties possessed significant financial resources and professional connections. Victoria's systematic approach had created evidentiary foundations that inexperienced counsel could not effectively challenge, while establishing new standards for investigative comprehensiveness and analytical sophistication in complex matrimonial asset disputes. The formal evidentiary hearing in Family Court Department 12 commenced on a Tuesday morning in October, with Judge Rebecca Morrison presiding over proceedings that would establish new precedents for addressing systematic asset concealment in high-net-worth matrimonial cases. The courtroom atmosphere reflected both the gravity of the financial evidence that would be presented and the significant disparity between the legal teams that would be arguing their respective positions before the court. Victoria Sterling entered the courtroom, accompanied by Margaret Chen and her comprehensive expert team, carrying organized evidence files that represented 18 months of systematic investigation and analysis. Her composed demeanor reflected the confidence that came from thorough preparation and professional validation of her analytical work. The transformation from underestimated espouse to expert witness in her own matrimonial proceedings demonstrated the power of comprehensive preparation combined with analytical excellence and strategic patience. David Sterling's appearance alongside James Anderson revealed the consequences of his inability to secure adequate legal representation for proceedings that would determine both his financial obligations and potential criminal liability. Anderson's obvious nervousness and inadequate preparation provided a stark contrast to the professional competence and systematic organization that characterized Victoria's legal team. The mismatch in representation quality would prove decisive during the complex evidentiary presentations that would follow. Judge Morrison's opening remarks established the procedural framework for presenting evidence that involved sophisticated financial analysis and expert testimony regarding systematic asset concealment. Her judicial experience had taught her to recognize cases that exceeded typical matrimonial dispute complexity, while requiring specialized attention to technical evidence and professional analytical methods that most family court proceedings did not involve. Margaret Chen's opening statement provided the court with a comprehensive overview of Victoria's evidence compilation and the systematic methodology that had been employed to document David's asset concealment. Her presentation outlined the scope of forensic accounting analysis, international asset investigation, and business valuation expertise that would demonstrate both the existence of concealed marital assets and the deliberate nature of David's financial manipulation. The evidence that will be presented today demonstrates systematic and deliberate asset concealment that began years before any formal marital difficulties became apparent. Margaret began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from comprehensive preparation and professional validation. Mrs. Sterling's investigation has revealed sophisticated financial arrangements designed to minimize the apparent value of marital assets while concealing income streams and business interests that rightfully belong to the marital estate. Anderson's opening response reflected both his inadequate preparation and his fundamental misunderstanding of the evidence that his client would need to address during formal proceedings. His statement focused on general arguments about asset classification and business valuation methodologies without specific reference to the comprehensive documentation that Victoria's team had compiled regarding David's financial arrangements and asset concealment. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from